Hey everybody, this is part one of a multi-part series on Instapoetry. This part will focus on the recently published Instructions for Traveling West by Joy Sullivan, and the next part will focus on RUPI KAUR and what it means to be a quote-unquote accessible poet. I hope you enjoy, and thank you all for coming to club today. Part 1. Mercy. If you'll indulge me for a second, I'd like to begin with a poem. This is Mercy by Joy Sullivan. Once, we were grilling zucchini from the garden. It was summertime, and I was about to leave you. A praying mantis landed on the grill. He was bright and beautiful, even as he fizzled and I burned all my fingertips trying to save him. You can't tell when an insect is in pain, but he must have been, and you put him in the grass so softly where I found and stomped him. And I think it surprised us, what we each defined as mercy. The first time I encountered that poem on my Twitter feed in April, I just went, wow. The poem struck me in a way few others have throughout my life, almost elementally, such that before I even had the chance to give it much conscious consideration, my emotional self had decided that this poem was important. That same day, I bought the book it originally appeared in, Joy Sullivan's Instructions for Traveling West. I've since come to have somewhat more complicated feelings about the collection as a whole. Instructions for Traveling West wasn't what I expected when I purchased it, but the way it seems to reflect current literary trends definitely made it a worthwhile read. I don't know for certain if Joy Sullivan has read much RUPI KAUR, so when I say that this book feels like KAURified literary poetry, I do mean that speculatively. We'll touch on some KAUR-like elements of the poetry itself in a second, but first I want to briefly examine how Sullivan's online persona is also KAUR-esque. Having been a successful marketer before returning to poetry a few years ago, Sullivan cultivates an interesting online presence. In interviews, she describes her creative process in somewhat more academic language, reflecting her history in teaching and academia. For instance, when describing a sequence of poems from this book that retells the Genesis story, she says, "It began with Eve, and it began almost as a rewriting of that Genesis story in which I gave Eve omniscience, and Adam got, awkwardness, and God got some social anxiety. And that was a story I could sort of find myself in, to invert traditional roles." Anyone who has heard poets like Chen Chen, Ocean Vuong, or Donica Kelly talk about their work will notice both a fairly casual approach to discussing poetry combined with this academic edge in the way she talks about her craft. Meanwhile, on social media and on her personal site, Sullivan presents herself as something more akin to the traditional Instapoet, posting pictures of travel, snippets of her work, and short-form videos discussing the writing life. In fact, in an interview, she states that she got her agent and book deal through her substantial Instagram platform. People in the know might be surprised to hear that yes, a poet does have a literary agent, and we'll touch on that more in the next video. Here's a great example of a really classically Instapoetry type post from her Instagram. It's actually a screenshot of a tweet, and the tweet reads like this. "Someone once asked me if I romanticize my life, but how would I know? I'm a poet. I can't help but feel romantic about my life, my little apartment, my fat yellow cat, my soft-hearted lover, the relentless rain that lushens everything, my unremarkable body, my hungry poems." What's especially interesting to me about this piece is the way it functions kind of like a verbal equivalent of a mood board. The list creates this moody poet core aesthetic, but that's sort of it. I'm extra interested in the way the word hungry is basically like a placeholder for whatever the reader wants it to mean. It feels like this word that's really active and really exciting, implying an intense need or passion, but in context it's really a bit hollow. Nothing in the list helps the reader, or at least doesn't help me understand what the poems are hungry for. This poetic tweet has a very distinct vibe. You can really feel it when you read it, but it resists serious analysis. Popping over to Sullivan's website again reveals another similarity between her and KAUR. Both websites feature pictures of their respective authors posed dramatically with their books, feature little line art doodles, and sell prints of individual poems through their online shops. I'm not a marketer, but I suspect it might be possible Sullivan tailors her image in these disparate settings in the hopes of growing her base by funneling different kinds of readers into her audience. Even her writing itself seems at times designed with the intent of courting both the academic poet and the more casual Instapoetry enjoyer. Reading Traveling West feels, at times, uncannily like reading a hybrid of literary poetry and Milk and Honey. As in KAUR, Sullivan's book is explicitly semi-autobiographical. Some of the poems drop into all lowercase at times that I can't personally track the reason for. Many are short and squarely center pathos over a broader thematic meaning. Another way of saying that is that many of the poems are vibey, like the tweet was. Often their top priority seems to be leaving the reader with a kind of feeling, think melancholy or elation especially, and they succeed in that priority roundly throughout this book, all 120-something pages of it over and over again. They succeed in sticking landings with this virtuosic regularity. There are a lot of breakups, a lot of gardens, and a lot of yearning in this book, which also will be familiar to readers of KAUR. This essay is going to contain some substantial critiques of Sullivan's book, so before I get into that, I want to make sure I invoke something I find too often gets left out of the discussion of KAUR, as well as Instapoetry generally. Like KAUR's poetry, Sullivan's has already begun to resonate with a pretty sizable audience. I think sometimes in our collective hurry to hate on something we perceive as Instapoetry, we forget that there are people out there who really enjoy Instapoetry as a genre, and I mean they truly honestly feel spoken to by it, or just have a good time reading it. I have been one of those people from time to time, but I was curious why regular readers enjoy it. So, at the suggestion of my friend Drake, who has also been doing some fantastic work on the YouTube channel here recently, putting together some animated shorts for us, thank you so much Drake, I love them, I perused the 5-star reviews of Traveling West on Goodreads to see what fans enjoyed. Overwhelmingly, positive reviews praised the poem's relatability. That so many people liked the poetry primarily because it reflected their own experiences back to them speaks to a tendency I've often encountered while discussing and teaching poetry, and it's one that I do find to be somewhat limiting in our ability to engage with literature. There is so much to learn from lyrics that lend us brief glimpses into the interior worlds of others or otherwise challenge us, just as I have learned so much about my own poetics during the course of writing this essay about a book with which I could relate only very little. While I certainly don't think it's at all wrong to like a book because it reminded you of yourself or your own experiences, I do hope that at least some readers of Instapoetry will branch out into other material as well. So, while I don't think relatability is in and of itself generally a valid standard by which to evaluate literature, I completely understand the impulse to be excited when a reader sees something of themselves reflected in another person's experiences. It can prove, for instance, that we are not alone in our suffering, that others have overcome it, and that therefore we can too. Meanwhile, another cluster of positive reviews praised Sullivan's ability to describe relatable experiences in a way that was novel, injecting the familiar with a clarity previously inaccessible to them. That is to say, her use of diction and image is stunning. That was the experience I first had when I first encountered Mercy. This poem does not resonate with me because of any personal experiences I've ever had. I've never been through anything like what it describes. Rather, it resonated because it allowed me to experience the intensity of Sullivan's feelings, or perhaps more accurately, what I imagine her feelings were, since I can't ever really know for certain what she actually felt. But more on projection later. In the meantime, the poem did something else for me as well. It reminded me of a fact I had kind of sort of half known, but which was made more impactful and more vivid through the revelation of reading. The reality that big, conceptual words like mercy don't actually mean the same thing to me that they do to you, even though we all go through life pretending, much of the time, that they do. So when readers of Sullivan's work say she has the power to render her experiences vividly thanks to unique diction, they are absolutely correct. When Sullivan stands in her own experiences, narrating them with her trademark intensity and authority, she is, in my opinion, at her very best. Part 2. Little Oddities. Popping over to the inside cover of Instructions for Traveling West, the book's tagline reads as follows. First, you must realize you're homesick for all the lives you're not living. Then, you must commit to the road and rising loneliness, to the sincere thrill of coming apart. More than anything else, what sticks out to me here is the way the speaker romanticizes her own suffering, that, quote, sincere thrill of coming apart. The way the speaker glamorizes her suffering is very typically Instapoetry. And if I'm honest, I don't usually vibe with poetry that centers this kind of speaker. I can find it hard sometimes not to think of romanticized suffering as a kind of coping mechanism. The speaker trying to make their pain glamorous so that it feels, if not more bearable, then at least more purposeful. When the speaker doesn't seem to be aware that this is what they're doing, I can sometimes feel a little bit turned off to the work. But it's not a deal breaker, and thankfully for me, this is a mode that the speaker will shift in and out of, rather than staying in for the entirety of the collection. Narratively, Instructions for Traveling West follows the speaker's experiences dealing with a series of difficult situationships, recovering from a psychologically damaging religious upbringing, managing her relationship with her mother, and navigating a succession of moves that ultimately take her west, to Oregon. While many of the poems can and do aim to stand on their own, all of them fit somewhere into this loose chronology, this plot, so to say, and deal with at least one of the aforementioned themes. Frequent readers of contemporary poetry collections who own a copy of Instructions for Traveling West will soon notice another odd thing about the book. It's really long. At 135 pages, it's over twice the length that's usual for the kind of book that it is, which often comes in at around 60 pages. About half the book's volume is taken up by prose poems, meaning there are around 70 of them, more than enough to sustain their own book. The final oddity I want to talk about is one that appears sporadically throughout the length of the collection, that is, the speaker's use of the word grief. Now, all poets have favorite words we come back to again and again. These are concepts that many of us feel are in some way foundational, though we would not be who we are without our deeply felt connection to them. For me, some of those words are becoming, gray, arrival, so I often find myself trying to be more specific about, for example, the kind of gray I'm describing, or to try to get at the feeling of grayness using other words. The word grief appears in a ton of Sullivan's poems, and it's such a trendy word right now in the poetry space that it can be kind of hard to tell exactly what she means by it in particular. Grief is a huge idea, more than huge enough to center a whole collection around, which has been done many times without risking exhausting the concept. The way that it drops into Sullivan's poems here was, for me at least, occasionally a little jarring. In a minute, I'm going to talk in more depth about a poem where a child interred in a Texas border concentration camp, quote, grows bright with grief. This is a surprising use of language because why is the grief bright? Presumably the brightness is meant to evoke the heat of the desert sun, but why is that being coupled with the grief? The poem moves on before it can really expand. In These Days People Are Really Selling Me on California, Sullivan's speaker characterizes a woman's hair found in a bird's nest as the air, quote, giving back grief. This is really interesting, that the woman's hair is found by the birds and given back as a nest, which the speaker characterizes as grief. But once again, the poem doesn't really give us enough information to decode this image. The language feels fantastic to read, and I can only imagine how good it must have felt to write. It's delightful and surprising, but unfortunately, I personally didn't feel equipped to move beyond that delight into a place of deeper thematic understanding. Still, that the word comes up so often tells me it probably resonates with Sullivan in a really special way, and I wish that more time in the collection was dedicated to expanding on that resonance so that I could come to understand it as well. Hey, quick editor's note here. So as I was putting this together, I was sort of dissatisfied with my analysis of These Days People Are Really Selling Me on California. I didn't know exactly why that was, but I just sort of had this gut instinct that, I wasn't getting the poem yet. So I went back and read it for, the 10 squillionth time, and something clicked for me. I think in this particular case, the issue is not that Sullivan is using the word grief vaguely, but rather that I just don't know that that word necessarily fits here at all. I'm not going to read the whole poem for you guys, but in context, it seems like this poem is another one about the speaker having a difficult relationship to childbearing, which is something that we'll see more of in a minute. I think the image of the nest is meant to suggest that Sullivan's speaker here feels like she might have more purpose if the birds used her hair to make a nest that they then raised their young in. So it's not really the air giving back grief, it's more like the air taking grief and giving back something else. At least that's how I'm reading the poem now. But all that aside, back to the episode. Part 3. Critiques. I want to begin this section with the prose poems. Although they make for an interesting formal through line and connective tissue for the collection, I think that the prose poems in aggregate detract from the book, mainly by interfering with its pacing. I want to talk about the prose poems as a unit by taking a deeper look at a particular one from the poem's back third. This is probably my favorite out of all of her prose poems in this collection, and it's called Open Mic. Open Mic. We were sitting quietly and waiting to read when a woman cut her poem short and began to shake. At first, I thought seizure and nearly stood until I saw the torque of her body lifting, beginning to shimmer. How language took her in an unbearable wave, drawing her limbs up, not like a dance, but like a lustrous god, a religion with no apostasy. Her shoulders trembled, mouth open and quaking, an animal in heavy rain. This is a poem, isn't it? Isn't it? My cheeks were wet. The shape of her, a question building for which I knew I had no answer. Watching her was like making love or slipping on ice or being born. You hit the hard edge of the whoosh and are ushered into something new, a ground bird tossed into the sky for the first time, up, 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 as if finally in flight. Open Mic displays all the strengths of Sullivan's prose poems, in addition to some of what I perceive to be their weaknesses. Immediately, you're likely to notice the beautiful language. One of my very favorite moments is, quote, her shoulders trembled, mouth open and quaking, an animal in heavy rain. It's absolutely wonderful, and I love the phrase, a religion with no apostasy, and the possibilities that it unlocks. I would love to know, for this speaker, in what other ways this reading is like a religious experience, and what it would mean for a religion to be so pervasive it's impossible to be an apostate. I'm also really fascinated by the implication that things have happened in this speaker's life to cause her to immediately associate religions with apostasy, so much so that she feels compelled to remind readers that they are, in fact, separable ideas. Some of the other poems in the collection do give us an idea of where this trauma originates, but I would have liked just an additional instance of it in this piece so that it could be stronger on its own. I also think the line breaks are working super well for this poem, especially in comparison to other prose poems throughout Traveling West. If you look closely, you'll see that the lines in Open Mic almost reach the right margin, but do seem to be broken intentionally. This lets the poem get away with being a prose poem, or at least prose-like, without committing fully to the arbitrariness of how prose lines are broken. Several of the other prose poems in this collection, which I won't go into a ton of detail about here, end up breaking their lines on fairly unimpactful words like of or and, because the right margin decides where the lines end. Of course, though, Open Mic isn't the only of Sullivan's prose poems to wow with its diction and imagery. Here are a few other examples of fantastic writing from the prose poems. In Hunger Pangs, I love the opening. I was raised on scripture, sharp as an eye tooth. In Comment Section, the phrase, someone is angry that I had an orgasm and then wrote the word orgasm, is hilarious and it rings emotionally true. On the other hand, there's this sentence from Open Mic. Watching her was like making love or slipping on ice or being born. Sullivan's prose poems have a thing for lists, and when I read them, I find that they kind of weaken the impact of the piece for me by scattering my attention. Any of these three images, if expanded upon, could sustain the entire piece. The poem seems really invested in simile, all of those like or as constructions, so as a reader I can't help but wonder why the poem doesn't really go in on its favorite. Furthermore, the list's lack of escalation or other organizing principle leaves it feeling a little bit scattered for me. This is something I could say about the poem as a whole. All of its images, almost every single one of which bowls me over as a reader, don't ultimately cohere. They feel a little bit disconnected from each other conceptually, although they don't have to. The lustrous god, the animal in heavy rain, and the shape of the woman's body being like a question mark could be made to connect if the poem guided me as a reader into what connections the speaker sees between those things, other than the fact that they are revelatory and stunning. Poems are, as I've said in previous videos, communication, just like any other kind of writing. They exist to express information encoded by the writer to be decoded by the reader, simple as. This information isn't the same as prose or journalism, or least of all scientific writing, of course, but it is a kind of information all the same. Most of the prose poems do contain information about the speaker, about parts of her worldview, about the narrative of her life, but I couldn't ever shake the feeling that the information could have been a little bit more organized. But here's the real kicker. In an interview with the Adroit Journal, a premier literary magazine for anyone who might be unfamiliar, Sullivan states outright that the prose poems in Traveling West might not be poems at all. Here's the exact quote. "As time goes on, I'm less interested in genre because I feel it limits a lot of writers. I get that if you're selling books on a shelf, you have to know what genre it is. My book is being called a collection of poems, though I didn't originally intend for many of the pieces to be read as such." And while I think it can be true that genre can be a restriction for the writer, for the reader it has immense use. Genre helps people looking to engage with art understand what it is they're encountering and how it would like to be approached. Elsewhere in the interview, Sullivan says some of the quote-unquote prose poems in Traveling West were originally envisioned as flash fiction or as lyric essays more than they were as poetry. I was really grateful to find this interview in the course of my writing and researching because it supports this inkling that I had as I was reading the book. Basically, that because the prose poems are so numerous and this book already so substantive, I think there are really two books here. The first, naturally, is the book of poems, and the second one could be a series of personal essays or flash fiction pieces that expand on the poetry. The next organizing feature of the collection I want to look at is rhetorical. I'm going to start by reading "The Electrician Sings Easy Love in the Kitchen While Fixing My Light." Sea ice around Antarctica reaches a record low, and now, on the news, a man rushes down the streets of Kiev, a toddler in his arms. The word war enters every room. Earth warms. In Texas, a child grows bright with grief. Everything threatens to burst. In the morning, my belly asks again for a baby. I leak with longing. No one has told my body yet about the world. All she hears is the sound of someone in the other room, still singing. As I read this poem, I notice two ideas being set into parallel. The first is global crises, the war in Ukraine, climate change, and children imprisoned along the US's southern border, and then on the other side, the speaker's own emotional distress over her indecision about childbearing. The structure of the poem suggests a likeness by confining the former set of ideas, the crises, to the first stanza, and the latter to the second, and also technically the third stanza, very briefly. It's only a couple of words. Upon reading the poem, then, I, as a reader, feel these two ideas clash up against each other during the stanza break, and I'm thereby able to detect the implied relationship. If you remember from some of our previous discussions here on the channel, this moment, where the poem shifts quickly from one topic to a seemingly unrelated one, is a kind of volta or turn. I think what the poem is trying to say is something akin to, the world is in an uncertain state that causes me to question my desire to raise children, but maybe I will anyway, since there is still hope somewhere. This doesn't really work for me, though, thematically, because the electrician singing at the end of the poem is such an unconvincing answer to the magnitude of the suffering being experienced elsewhere in the piece. Let me pause for a second here just to make sure I'm being absolutely clear, because this is going to be really, really important, especially moving into our next video on RUPI KAUR. What I am saying, and what I'm about to say, does not in any way suggest it is ever wrong to center your own experiences and emotions in a poem, not by any stretch. In fact, what I want to communicate is actually the exact opposite. In my estimation, poems are most useful for expressing experiences to which you, the writer, can lay claim, about which you can speak with the authority that comes from lived experience. The problem this poem stumbles into is the way it sets the reader up to engage with cataclysmic acts of violence, but then uses them only as a means by which to contextualize the speaker's feelings. This then causes the speaker's feelings and the poem's crises to compete for space within the text. Notably, the poem lends the speaker's emotional state more thematic weight than the crises. It does this both by introducing her emotional state after the volta, implying that this is the true subject of the poem, and by ending the poem on the speaker's feelings, thereby adding additional emphasis. I think the poem would have been more effective had the speaker centered issues directly affecting her, rather than more distant ones that feel tokenized by their brief mention. Why use other people's existential suffering to explain an unrelated individual's emotional suffering? It's not that this comparison, suffering is like suffering, is strictly wrong, just that the poem could have just as well explained its speaker's emotional pain on its own terms, without the use of this parallel. I'm kind of clumsily talking around an idea that I honestly don't know if there's a term for, so I came up with one. I'm gonna start calling it rhetorical tokenizing. Within this framework, the reader is asked to care about the suffering of people other than the speaker, only insofar as doing so helps them to understand the speaker specifically. I think that when a speaker rhetorically tokenizes another person or group of people, what they're doing is fundamentally a type of projection. The speaker of these poems, presumably, has not been herself a child imprisoned along the US's southern border and doesn't really know what it's like to be an individual in that situation. When she deploys those ideas as images rhetorically, she does so comfortably insulated from the phenomena she's describing. Therefore, what she's really writing about is what she imagines those situations to be like. For me, to use her own idea of what it might be like to experience that trauma in order to explain very different trauma is inaccurate, both factually and emotionally. The stakes of their inclusion are not at all the same for her as they would be for someone who's more directly impacted. In case I'm not coming through 100% here, I want to emphasize the weight of a specific word in this poem. As Sullivan writes, the word war enters every room. That's right, the word I wanted to emphasize was word as a modifier for war. For this speaker, there is no immediate threat of total disaster. For her, war is a very disturbing concept. And I don't say that because I doubt that she feels truly shaken by it, nor do I doubt that the concept of war makes her question the ethics of having children. And yet, within the world of the poem, war is materially devastating millions of currently living people, like right now. That, and the speaker's concerns about raising children, don't need to exist in the same poem. It's the poet's choice to put them into conversation, just as it's the poet's choice to thematically sort of set one aside so that the other can be a little bit more prominent. This is a thing that the speaker does more than once. In this poem called Balloon, she narrates all the ways in which microplastics are altering both our internal and external ecosystems. She writes, "A sparrow sliced on a Coke bottle, the way the sky is littered with human joy, how glitter gluts fish." Again, the language here is deliberate and precise and beautiful, and the line break on sliced is a particularly nice touch. And then, in the next and concluding stanza, she says, "It's difficult to be alive and full of sharp edges." When I started this, I was trying to write a funny poem. The ending is emotionally evocative, it's clever, and it's very neat. At the same time, after having spent many carefully rendered lines and stanzas recounting actual animal suffering, the poem suddenly reorients itself around the speaker's personal pain, while simultaneously implying a parallel between that pain and the animal's deaths. To me, those things aren't really equivalent, emotionally or factually. When the speaker suddenly begins to mourn how the animal's deaths have made it difficult for her to write funny poems, I feel just a little tricked as a reader, I guess. I feel sort of used, like the poem didn't actually care about the animals all that much, but rather used them as a means by which to understand the speaker. The poem essentially turns away from the material harm being done in favor of centering the speaker's coyness. It kind of rhetorically tokenizes the animals that it at first asked us to care about. To be fair, there's a really long history in the Western literary tradition of using animals as objects onto which writers can project their own desires, anxieties, or other imaginings. Rilke's 1903 piece, The Panther, is probably one of the most famous examples of this. In the poem, the speaker watches a panther trapped in a featureless cage pace in maddening circles, a convenient metaphor for human suffering in the face of a society industrializing and mechanizing faster than the mind could really comprehend. Likewise, Sullivan's poem Tiger Farm aims to use a caged jungle cat as a metaphor for humans becoming increasingly unwelcome within a system that they've created. The poem opens with an incredible deftness of image. A tiger cub wakes to find his explosive body, fire stripes, crocodile eyes, the whole of him beginning to be huge. Initially, the poem appears to be in a close third-person point of view on the tiger, narrating his daily life on this quote-unquote farm with similarly impactful language. Then, at the end, this kind of volta occurs, in which the poem is revealed to have been in the second person all along. Quote, "In dreams he senses it, same as you, that beyond the compound, the cubicle, there must exist something, somewhere, wild as grass, so cool and soft beneath the paw." Here, more explicitly than elsewhere, the speaker compares her experiences to that of a tiger literally locked in a chain-link enclosure. I'm just gonna come right out and say it. To me, a cage and a cubicle are a false equivalency. The difference between them, total captivity and a dissatisfying work environment, is like really, really vast. But if, as I've said in previous videos, poems are after emotional truth rather than factual truth, does it still matter that tigers in cages are not literally like cubicle workers if the underlying feelings we as readers have about those concepts are similar? Well, to me at least, the question is irrelevant because those feelings aren't the same. While both cages and cubicles may evoke feelings of trappedness, it's again the stakes of those kinds of captivity that are monumentally different. Let me put it like this. At the end of the day, the speaker goes home from her cubicle. The tiger stays in its cage. In addition to this comparison being, to me at least, a little imprecise, this again creates a framework in which the poem only asks readers to empathize with the tiger insofar as it reflects their own experiences. The speaker seems to care primarily about the tiger's suffering only as much as so doing allows her to express her own struggles under capitalism. Once the poem believes it has established this comparison, it just kind of moves on. This quickly becomes an ethical question as much as it is one about poetic technique. Is it right for a speaker to use the likeness of a tiger confined to a life of captivity in order to generate empathy primarily for themselves? Is it right to say, my job is like a cage, in the same collection in which the speaker alludes to the fact that right now, under the same capitalist, imperialist system she critiques, actual children are being kept in actual cages? I think Rilke's poem avoids this same criticism by permitting a reading in which it really is just about the panther if we want it to be. It's entirely possible to read The Panther as a poem critiquing the horribly inhumane zoologischen Gärten, which is to say early ancestors of zoos, in which animals' enclosures were nothing more than metal bars and dirt. While the speaker would still be projecting onto the animal in this case, imagining he knows how it feels, he would be doing so in the service of advocating for better treatment of it, at the same time that he is handily creating a metaphor for industrialization. As a poet, I can empathize with how I imagine The Panther or Tiger Farm might have come about. I too have had those Rilke moments where I've seen something in the real world that made me go, my gods, this would be really, really good imagery to describe exactly what I've been going through recently. Unfortunately though, writing purely from that place of passion results in flat poems, in my experience. It treats experiences as themselves rhetorical tokens, only useful insofar as it helps me as a poet make a point. It ignores the fact that the world is just the world and things just happen, not for us, but just because they do. It ignores the fact that the truly miraculous phenomenon is not that the world in some way reflects us as people, but rather that we as people have the capacity to take those experiences and remold them into art. I'm going to posit something that may sound a little bit radical. I think that we should always write poetry from a place of understanding that most of what we are doing is projection. Otherwise, we risk suggesting, and thus making it a kind of lyric truth, that the world actually reflects human perception. For what it's worth, I do think this poem could be reworked to avoid its current issues. For instance, the poem could introduce the quote-unquote real subject, the speaker's job troubles, sooner, so that it doesn't feel like a bait and switch at the very end. I think the poem could also flip its priorities, that is, generate empathy for the tiger by having the speaker talk about her job. Finally, the poem could, as I've just suggested, admit explicitly to its own projection. It could admit that it doesn't really know what it's like to be a tiger, and that all it has is its own suffering, which, again, let me be absolutely clear, is reason enough for a poem, as all emotion is. To conclude, I want to bring us home with the poem that led me to buying this collection in the first place. Mercy comes really early in Instructions for Traveling West. I adore the blunt brutality of the sentence, "A praying mantis landed on the grill," which takes up the space of an entire line, holding our attention on the horror of it. Though the mantis isn't dead yet, its eventual end has just been guaranteed. I keep coming back again and again to the line break on "even as he fizzled and I burned," because it's so syntactically unexpected. Finally, I want to highlight the poem's last sentence, and I think it surprised us what we each defined as mercy. At last, we come to understand why it is the speaker and her beloved are about to break up despite this intimate moment. They each understand mercy, which in this case is kind of a synecdoche for the world, in fundamentally different ways, and that makes them incompatible, simple as. To one of them, mercy is saving the creature, setting it in the grass knowing that it's already been burned and is going to die slowly. To the other, it's killing the creature quickly, ensuring its death but limiting its suffering. Rather than presenting one of these understandings of mercy as faulty or inferior, the poem is more interested just on the fact that two different interpretations of the word exist. This is presented, like the death of the mantis itself, as a neutral, irrevocable fact. These people are different, and they will never see the world in the same way. This poem is, to me, the most emotionally intense, the most necessary, and the one only Joy Sullivan could have written. Unfortunately, Sullivan has faced some really harsh criticism online since her book came out, especially on Twitter, at least that's where I have seen it. There, I saw this rash of comments underneath reposts of her prose poems saying that they were the work of a quote-unquote narcissist. It's a really disturbingly common and severe insult of poetry that toes this imaginary line between the literary and the commercial, especially when that poetry is written by women. So I want to take a second to analyze it here. What does it mean, really, to call someone a narcissist? Clinical understandings of that word aside, in the colloquial sense, I think that to accuse someone of being a narcissist is to say, essentially, that they are self-centered, self-indulgent, and perhaps even emotionally manipulative. In short, to cry narcissist is to use the word as a shorthand for, to use the words of Barry Keoghan, sort of like an evil person. Psychologically, I think calling a writer you dislike a narcissist gives you permission to disregard them and anything they write without really having to think about it. After all, you have already characterized them as fundamentally shallow and kind of untrustworthy, so why bother engaging with their work, which is likely to be the same? Frankly, I find that to be intellectually and emotionally dishonest and lazy. It bothers me a lot because, as I learned by writing this essay, as I've learned again and again and again from every workshop, every video for this channel, every podcast episode, that there is so much richness to be found in the work of writers whose works don't quite land for us, works that make us feel uncomfortable or upset, or that we just plain old dislike. As we move into part 2 of this series and begin to talk about RUPI KAUR and the quote-unquote accessible poet, a term by which Sullivan has also self-identified, I want us to stay rooted in the purpose of the St. Balthasar University English Club. What I'm coming back around to here is essentially the thesis of this entire project that Andrew and I began undertaking 4 years ago. That even troubled work is worth looking at with empathy and with rigor, because it has so much to teach all of us about ourselves and about each other. Thank you all for listening. Hey guys, thanks again for stopping by campus for club today. Again, this is part 1 of an at least 2-part series on Instapoetry, RUPI KAUR, and the accessible poet. As some of you will know, I am in the process of moving to Austria. I'm hoping to get this episode out before I fly out, and episode 2 will come sometime after I have relocated, so it might take just a little bit to get everything set up. In the meantime, you can follow us on Instagram and on Twitter at SBU_English Club. You can join our Discord, the link to which should be in the video description. And if you feel like supporting us, you can toss us a couple of books over on Ko-Fi or on PayPal. The links to those should be in the description as well, but if they're not, you can find them on our website, which is EnglishClubPodcast.com, and you can just pop on over to the Support Us tab. If not, though, just your listening, leaving a comment, leaving a like, subscribing if you enjoyed this is more than enough support. We're so glad to have all of you here, and I hope that you'll be looking forward to the next one, whether that's part 2 of this, something Andrew's cooking up, or just a good old-fashioned podcast episode. Anyway, I've been Jay, and I will see you guys around campus.